The news had spread quietly across the galaxy the way bad news always does, in whispers, in warning looks, in messages sent between species who had learned the hard way. Do not take the job. It did not matter how much the pay was. It did not matter that the offer came stamped with the golden seal of the Vethrai Empire, the most powerful ruling house in 7-star systems. It did not matter that Empress Sorva herself had signed the request. Every babysitter who had walked through the doors of the Imperial Nursery had walked back out changed, pale, shaking, and absolutely certain they would never return. The hatchlings had seen to that. There were 4 of them. Kale was the oldest and the biggest, already the size of a large earth wolf, with dark blue scales that caught the light like polished stone. He had a habit of staring at strangers without blinking for so long that even trained soldiers felt the urge to step back. Dora was second, smaller than Kale but faster, with a sharp mind and sharper teeth that she was not shy about showing. She had once bitten clean through a steel feeding tray simply because she did not like what was on it. SIV was the quiet one, which somehow made things worse. He did not roar or snap. He simply watched, and then when the moment was right, he would release a slow, thick cloud of dark smoke directly into the face of whoever was closest. The Maruvian warrior had lasted exactly 40 minutes before SIV found his moment. And then there was Rux. Little Rux was the youngest and the smallest, barely reaching the knee of an adult Vethrai. His scales were a soft bronze color and his eyes were very large and very golden. He looked, by all accounts, absolutely harmless. This was the most dangerous thing about him. Rux had a gift for finding the one thing in a room that would cause the most chaos and going straight for it. He had flooded the nursery twice. He had somehow set the ceiling on fire during what was supposed to be a quiet rest period. He had once figured out how to open the door of the Royal Communications Chamber and had walked inside during a live intersystem broadcast. The Empress had not spoken of that day since. Together, the 4 of them had destroyed 11 babysitters in 4 months. The first had been a Krellian elder, chosen because Krellians were known across the galaxy for their patience and their calm nature. They had deep spiritual practices. They meditated. They were not easily startled. The elder had arrived in long robes, carrying a bag of gentle learning materials, fully prepared to spend a quiet afternoon with 4 young hatchlings. She had lasted 22 minutes. When the palace staff found her sitting outside the nursery doors, she was completely still, staring straight ahead, her learning materials scattered behind her in pieces. She had simply stood up, bowed once in the direction of the Empress's chambers, and walked to the transport bay without a word. She never explained what had happened inside. She never came back. The second and third babysitters had been a pair of Luvani caretakers, a species well known for working with difficult young creatures across the outer systems. They came as a team with equipment, with a plan, and with impressive references. They were gone within the first hour. One of them was found hiding behind a large decorative vase in the east corridor. The other had somehow ended up on the roof. After that, the palace had tried a different approach. A professional from the Galactic Childcare Authority arrived, trained, certified, and carrying a badge that said she had handled over 300 difficult cases. Kale had stared at her for so long without blinking that she had quietly set her badge down on the table, picked up her bag, and left before she had even taken off her coat. Then came the warrior. The Maruvian people were fighters by nature, tall and broad and built for situations that would break others. Sending one to babysit was unusual, but the palace was running out of options. He had lasted the longest, 40 minutes as mentioned, before SIV had found his moment and released the smoke. The warrior had stumbled out of the nursery coughing, eyes red, and had stood in the corridor for a long time before he said, very quietly, that he would rather go back to the border wars than return to that room. The military care robot had seemed like the perfect solution. It had no feelings to hurt, no nerves to shake, no instincts to trigger. It was built from reinforced materials, programmed with thousands of caretaking protocols, and had a calming voice designed specifically for difficult young subjects. The palace engineers had been confident. The hatchlings had dismantled it in under 7 minutes. Rux had kept one of its arms as a toy. By the time Diplomat Finn was called into the Empress's private chamber, the situation had become serious. Finn was a small, careful creature from the Delvari system, with pale gray skin and long thin fingers that he tended to press together when he was nervous, which was most of the time. He had served the Vethrai Empire for 12 years and had handled difficult diplomatic situations before. But standing in front of Empress Sorva, watching her golden eyes look at him with quiet desperation behind all that royal dignity, he felt more nervous than he had in a long time. She did not need to explain the problem. He already knew it. Everyone knew it. The summit was in 3 days. It was not optional. Leaders from 9 different systems would be there, and the Empress's presence was required. She could not bring the hatchlings, not to something that important, not when one wrong moment could turn a peace discussion into an incident. But she also could not leave them with no one. The last time she had tried that, Rux had gotten into the palace kitchen and Dora had terrorized the night staff until sunrise. She needed someone. And the list of willing candidates was, at this point, completely empty. Finn pressed his fingers together. There was one option. He had not wanted to bring it up. It felt strange and he knew how it would sound. But he had been thinking about it for 2 days, turning it over in his mind, and he could not find a reason why it was wrong. Only a reason why it was unexpected. He cleared his throat. The Empress looked at him. He said the word quietly, almost like a question. Humans. The room was still for a moment. Finn explained carefully what he meant. The humans had a small diplomatic outpost nearby, not far from the palace planet. They were a young species by galactic standards, only recently part of the wider interstellar community, not widely respected yet by the older systems. But they had a quality that Finn had noticed over his years of working near them: they did not frighten easily. Not in the way other species did. They had a strange relationship with danger. They walked toward things that made other species walk away. They stayed calm in situations that broke more experienced beings. And they were, by all available records, remarkably good with young creatures. He had read something once, in a human cultural document, about how they raised their own children. It had struck him as both exhausting and impressive. Human young were apparently also quite chaotic. The humans had simply developed ways of dealing with chaos that other species had never needed to learn. The Empress listened without speaking. When Finn finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She looked out through the high window of her chamber at the dark sky beyond, where the stars of her empire stretched in every direction. She had ruled for a long time. She had made hard decisions before. She was not too proud to try something new. She looked back at Finn. She told him to make the call. Finn nodded, pressed his fingers together one last time, and went to send a message to the human outpost. He was not sure what would happen next. He was not sure any human would agree to come. He was not even sure it was a good idea. But it was the last idea anyone had. And somewhere in the palace behind him, past 2 sets of heavy doors, in a nursery with scorched walls and a broken robot arm lying in the corner, for hatchlings were very much awake, and very much waiting for whoever was foolish enough to try next. The message arrived at the human outpost at a quiet time of the evening, when most of the staff had finished their work and were sitting together in the common room sharing food and talking about nothing important. Diplomat Finn's message was short and politely worded, but the meaning was clear enough. The Vethrai Empire needed a babysitter. The job involved 4 young hatchlings. The previous 11 caregivers had all left early. The summit was in 3 days. The pay was generous. Any volunteer would be welcomed with great gratitude by the Empress herself. Senior Diplomat George read it first. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the table, picked up his cup of tea, and took a long, slow sip without saying anything. The others in the room looked at him. He read it out loud. The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. 11 babysitters, said Felix, who handled trade communications and had very strong opinions about personal safety. 11. It says 11 right there. One of them was a Maruvian warrior, said Ada, looking at the message over George's shoulder. A warrior. They sent a warrior to babysit and he still left. The robot lasted 7 minutes, said Felix. 6 minutes and 40 seconds actually, said Ada, who had read faster. George set his cup down. He was a steady man, not easily rattled, but even he had a look on his face that suggested this was not a message he had been hoping to receive during a quiet evening. He looked around the room at his small team: Felix, Ada, young Callum, who mostly handled scheduling, and a few others who had gone very still the moment the message was read out loud. I am not going to force anyone, George said. This is completely voluntary. The Empress needs help and we have been asked. That is all. If someone wants to go, they can go. If nobody wants to go, I will send a polite reply and that will be the end of it. Nobody moved. Felix looked at the ceiling. Ada suddenly became very interested in something on her data pad. Callum picked up a piece of bread and began eating it with great focus, as though it was the most important thing happening in the room. George waited. He was a patient man. After about 30 seconds of complete silence, he nodded slowly. Right then, he said. I will draft the reply. I'll go. The voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned. Nora was standing there with a mug in one hand, leaning against the door frame in the relaxed way she always stood, like she had all the time in the world. She was not a senior diplomat. She was 26, one of the younger members of the outpost team, brought on mostly to help with cultural translation work and general outreach. She had short dark hair and a calm face that very rarely showed much surprise at anything. She had clearly heard the whole message from the hallway. George looked at her. "Nora." "I heard what it said," she told him. 4 hatchlings, 3 days, royal palace. "I can do that." Felix turned in his chair to look at her properly. "Did you hear the part about the warrior?" "Yes." "And the robot?" "Yes, Felix. The robot lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. I heard you the first time." She pushed off from the door frame and walked into the room, setting her mug down on the table. "I grew up with 4 younger siblings. I have been the oldest in a house full of chaos my entire life. I once spent an entire afternoon stopping my youngest brother from taking apart the kitchen. I am not afraid of difficult young creatures." The room was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet this time. Ada looked up from her data pad. "They breathe fire." "Small bursts," Nora said. "It said small bursts in the message." "That is not the reassuring detail you think it is," said Felix. Nora looked at George. George looked back at her for a long moment. He was trying to find a reason to say no that was not simply that he was worried about her, because Nora was an adult and he knew she would not thank him for treating her like she needed protecting. "You are sure?" he said. It was not really a question. "I am sure," she said. He nodded once. "Then I will tell Finn you are coming." What happened next was something that nobody in the room had planned for, and it came from the small back hallway that connected the common room to the sleeping quarters. A sound. A soft, high, happy sound. Everyone turned again. Coming through the doorway, moving in the determined and slightly unsteady way of someone who had only recently figured out that legs were a useful thing to have, was a baby. She was 10 months old, round-faced, with bright curious eyes that looked at the room full of people with great interest and absolutely no concern. She was wearing a small yellow outfit and had 1 sock on and 1 sock missing, which was a situation she seemed completely unbothered by. She moved along the edge of the doorway, holding it with 1 small hand for balance, and when she spotted Nora across the room her whole face broke into a wide, delighted smile. This was Ren. Ren was the daughter of Nora's older sister, Bee, who was currently attending a 3-day diplomatic conference on the other side of the station and who had left Ren in Nora's care that morning with a bag full of supplies, a long list of instructions, and the confident belief that nothing interesting would happen at a quiet outpost during a routine work week. Nora crossed the room, picked Ren up off the floor and settled her onto her hip. Ren grabbed a handful of Nora's hair immediately and held on. "There is a problem," said Ada, watching this. "She comes with me," said Nora simply. The room erupted again, quieter this time but no less alarmed. "You cannot take a baby to the Imperial Palace," said Felix. "I cannot leave her here either," said Nora. "Bee is gone for 3 days. The summit is 3 days. The timing is what it is." "Nora. She is 10 months old, Felix. She cannot even walk properly yet. She is not going to cause any trouble." Nora looked down at Ren, who was now examining Nora's collar with deep scientific interest. "She is very easy. She sleeps well, she eats well, and she thinks almost everything is funny. She will be fine." George was quiet through all of this. He was looking at Ren with an expression that was hard to read. Then he looked at Nora. Then back at Ren, who chose that exact moment to look up at him with her wide bright eyes and give him a smile so open and so completely trusting that something in his chest moved in a way he had not expected. He sighed. "Keep her close," he said. "And send word the moment anything feels wrong." Nora nodded. "I will." She went to pack. The rest of the evening was spent in a low murmur of worried conversation that Nora was not present for. Felix said 3 times that he had a bad feeling. Ada looked up everything she could find about Vethrai hatchling behavior, which did not make her feel better. Callum sat quietly and ate another piece of bread. Outside the outpost windows, the stars were steady and still, and the palace planet hung in the distance like a dark jewel, lit faintly around its edges by the glow of its own atmosphere. By morning, Nora had a small bag packed, Ren's much larger bag packed, Ren herself dressed in a fresh yellow outfit with both socks on, and a calm expression that had not changed since the night before. A transport pod from the palace arrived at the outpost dock just after dawn. 2 large Vethrai palace staff stepped out, looked at Nora, looked at the baby on her hip, looked at each other and said nothing. One of them sent a quick message back to the palace. Whatever answer came back, they accepted it without comment and simply gestured toward the pod. Nora walked past them and got in. Back at the outpost, Felix, Ada, Callum and the others stood at the dock window and watched the transport pod lift smoothly away from the dock and rise into the pale morning sky, growing smaller until it was just a point of light, and then nothing. Felix shook his head slowly. "Humans," he said, in the tone of someone who had known humans his whole life and still found them completely impossible to understand. Absolutely no sense of danger. None at all. Nobody disagreed with him. But somewhere above them, moving through the quiet space between the outpost and the palace planet, Nora sat with Ren in her lap, and Ren looked out the small round window at the stars going past with the same wide, fearless eyes she brought to everything. And she laughed. The palace was enormous. Nora had known it would be large, she had seen pictures, had read the descriptions in the cultural files back at the outpost, but knowing something and standing inside it were two very different things. The ceilings were so high that the upper parts of the walls disappeared into shadow. The floors were made of dark stone that had been polished so smooth it reflected everything like still water. The corridors were wide enough to fit 3 transports side by side, and the walls were carved with patterns that told stories in a language Nora could not read but could feel the weight of. Old stories, important ones, the kind that had been there for centuries and intended to stay. The palace staff who walked them through the corridors were tall and quiet. They did not make conversation. They moved with the particular kind of stillness that came from years of working in a place where everything was serious and formal and done exactly the right way. They glanced at Nora occasionally and at Ren more than occasionally, but they did not say anything about the baby on her hip or the soft bag of toys hanging from her shoulder. Ren, for her part, was having a wonderful time. She looked at everything. She reached toward the carved walls as they passed. She made small interested sounds at the ceiling. When one of the palace staff glanced down at her, she stared back at them with enormous eyes and then broke into a wide grin that showed her 4 small teeth. The staff member looked away quickly and kept walking. They stopped outside a set of very large doors. The doors were thick and dark and had marks on them that Nora recognized after a moment as scorch marks. Claw marks too, long ones, running down the lower half of the left door at a height that suggested they had been made from the inside. The senior staff member turned to Nora. His expression was composed and professional, but his eyes had the look of someone delivering information they were personally glad they did not have to deal with. He told her that the hatchlings had been awake since early morning. He told her that they had already been fed, so she would not need to manage mealtime for a few hours. He told her that the nursery had been restocked after the last incident. He said the word incident in a very careful way that suggested it had been something significantly worse than the word implied. He told her that the Empress would return in 3 days and that the palace communication system was available if she needed anything. He paused. He looked at her once more, then at Ren, who was currently chewing thoughtfully on the strap of the toy bag. He seemed to want to say something else. Something along the lines of "Are you absolutely certain? Or perhaps you still have time to change your mind? Or possibly would you like us to call someone?" But he was a professional and so he said none of those things. He simply gave a short formal bow, reached out and opened the doors. The smell hit first. Warm and smoky like a fire that had recently been put out, mixed with something sharp and animal underneath it. Then the sound, a low rustling, a heavy movement, the particular silence of creatures who have heard a door open and stopped whatever they were doing to find out what was coming through it. Nora walked in. The nursery was large, though it felt smaller than it probably was because of everything in it. The walls were dark stone like the rest of the palace, but here they were marked heavily, blackened in long streaks near the ceiling, scratched at the lower levels, with one section near the far corner that looked like it had been repaired recently and was already marked again. There were objects around the room that might once have been furniture and toys but were now in various states of being taken apart. A large padded structure that had probably been a resting area was on its side. Several feeding bowls were stacked in a tower that had clearly been built on purpose and just as clearly been knocked down and rest-tacked multiple times. The floor was covered in a deep layer of nesting material, thick woven fibers that had been pushed and pulled into different shapes across different parts of the room. And in the middle of all of it, 4 pairs of eyes turned toward the door. Nora had a moment, just one very short, to take them all in before things started happening. Kale was exactly as described. Large, dark blue, with the kind of stillness that was not calm but coiled. He was sitting upright near the center of the room and he looked at Nora the way he looked at everything, without blinking, without moving, with his whole body oriented toward her like a question he had not decided the answer to yet. He was bigger than she had expected. Bigger than the files had suggested. Dora was to the left, lower to the ground, her weight shifted forward in a way that Nora recognized immediately. It was the posture of someone about to move fast. Sci-Fi was further back, half in shadow, watching. Rux was behind Kale, just his large golden eyes visible over the curve of his brother's shoulder, wide and bright and intensely curious. There was perhaps 1 second of stillness. Then Cale opened his mouth and roared. It was loud. It was very loud. It bounced off the stone walls and came back from every direction at once, and it was the kind of sound that did something to the base of the spine, something old and biological and very insistent about the idea of running. The nesting material on the floor shifted from the force of it. The doors behind Nora rattled slightly in their frame. Nora blinked. At almost the same moment, Dora moved. She crossed the distance between them faster than something her size had any right to move and snapped her jaws together in the air directly in front of Nora's face. Not a bite, a warning, sharp and loud as a crack of stone. Nora took a small half-step back. Just one. Then she stopped. And then SIV from across the room, took a slow breath and released it. A long, thick cloud of dark gray smoke that rolled across the floor and rose up directly into Nora's face. She closed her eyes. She turned her head slightly to the side. She waited for it to pass. When she opened her eyes again, they were watering a little, and she blinked twice to clear them. That was all. She did not scream. She did not run. She did not drop Ren or the bag or make any of the sounds that the hatchlings had learned to expect from the creatures that came through that door. She simply stood there, eyes a little wet from the smoke, and looked at the 4 of them with an expression that was not fear and was not anger. It was patience. She had seen this before. Not from hatchlings, not from scaled creatures in a palace nursery, but from small humans in a small house who had learned that being loud and sharp and sudden was how you found out whether a person was safe. She had passed that test many times. She knew exactly what to do. She walked to an open space on the floor, sat down, crossed her legs and set the toy bag in front of her. She lifted Ren off her hip and settled her into her lap. Then she opened the bag and took out a set of soft blocks in different colors and began to stack them, one on top of the other, without looking up. She did not speak. She did not look at the hatchlings. She just stacked the blocks. The room was very quiet. Cale had stopped roaring. Dora had pulled back and was watching with her head tilted. SIV had gone still. Even Rux, behind Cale's shoulder, had gone very still, his golden eyes tracking every movement of Nora's hands. Nobody had ever done this before. Every other creature that had come through that door had reacted. Had made it into something, a battle, a retreat, a negotiation. Nobody had ever simply sat down. Ren had been very patient through the roar and the snap and the smoke, in the way that babies are sometimes patient when they are too busy looking at everything to be frightened by any one thing. She had turned her face into Nora's shoulder briefly during the roar. But now she was upright again, and she had spotted the 4 large creatures across the room, and she was looking at them. Really looking. Her eyes went to Cale first, so big and dark blue and strange. Then to Dora, then SIV, then to little Rux with his bronze scales and his huge golden eyes looking straight back at her. Something in Ren's face changed. Her eyes went very wide. Her cheeks went round. Her whole small body seemed to gather itself up with feeling, the way babies do when something hits them right in the center of their chest and they have only one way to let it out. And then she screamed. Not in fear. Not in pain. In absolute, complete, total delight. It was the loudest, happiest sound that room had ever heard, bouncing off the scorched stone walls and filling every corner, and it was so unexpected and so purely joyful that for one long moment every creature in that room, hatchlings who had terrified 11 caregivers, a human woman who had kept her face perfectly calm through a roar and a smoke cloud, went completely still. And Rux, very slowly, leaned out from behind Cale's shoulder. His golden eyes were enormous. He had never heard a sound like that before. Rux stared at Ren. Ren stared back at Rux. The rest of the room was completely still. Cale had not moved. Dora had not moved. SIV had not moved. Even Nora had stopped stacking the soft blocks and was sitting quietly, watching, not making a sound because something was happening and she did not want to interrupt it. Ren's laugh had faded to a wide, open smile, the kind that took up most of her face. She was sitting in Nora's lap with both small hands pressed flat on the floor in front of her, leaning forward slightly, looking at Rux the way she looked at things that interested her deeply, with her whole face, her whole body, like looking was something she did with everything she had. Rux was still leaning out from behind Cale's shoulder. His bronze scales caught the light in the room and gave them a soft warm glow. His golden eyes were very wide. He was trying to understand what had just happened. In his short life he had made many creatures make many sounds. He knew the sound of fear. He knew the sound of frustration. He knew the sound that the robot had made in its final moments, which had been deeply satisfying. He did not know this sound. This sound had done something strange to him. It had not frightened him. It had not made him want to chase or snap or investigate in the way danger made him want to investigate. It had made him want to hear it again. He did not know why. He just knew he did. He shifted his weight. His tail moved behind him, flicking once to the side the way it always did when he was thinking. Ren's eyes dropped immediately to the tail. Her face did the thing again, cheeks going round, eyes going wide, and she let out a short bright burst of laughter, her hands lifting off the floor and patting together in front of her. Rux froze. He looked at his tail. He looked at Ren. He looked at his tail again. Very slowly, very deliberately, watching Ren's face the entire time, he flicked his tail again. Ren laughed harder. Something changed in Rux's expression. It was subtle, the way expressions on scaled faces are always subtle, but Nora saw it clearly from where she sat. His eyes brightened. His head came up slightly. His small chest rose. It was the look of a creature who had just discovered something wonderful and was already trying to figure out how to make it happen again. He flicked his tail a third time faster. Ren shrieked with laughter, a full-body laugh that made her tip sideways in Nora's lap. Nora caught her automatically, and Ren grabbed Nora's arm and laughed into it, then straightened up and looked at Rux again immediately, breathless and grinning, already waiting. Rux flicked his tail back and forth in a fast rhythm. Ren made a sound that could only be described as pure happiness given a voice. She bounced in Nora's lap, her whole small body moving with it. Kale watched this from his position in the center of the room. He watched his smallest brother flicking his tail back and forth for a creature that barely came up to Rux's knee when standing, and he watched that creature respond with a noise and a movement that he had never seen any living thing produce before. It was not something he could categorize easily. It was not submission. It was not challenge. It was not any of the things he had learned to expect from other creatures. It looked, Kale thought, like joy. He took one step forward. Nora noticed but did not react. She kept her body relaxed and her breathing steady, and she let Kale do what he was going to do. He crossed the room slowly and lowered his large dark head to look at Ren from a closer distance. He was much bigger than Rux, and his presence changed the air and the space around him, the way large things do. He stopped about an arm's length from Nora and simply looked at the baby with his unblinking gaze. Ren looked back at him. For a moment she was still, taking him in, the size of him, the dark blue scales, the golden eyes so much larger than Rux's, the way the light moved differently around something that big. Nora's hand rested lightly on Ren's back, ready, but she did not pull her away. Then Ren reached out one small hand toward Kale's face. Her fingers were very small against the air between them. She was not quite close enough to reach him, and she knew it, so she leaned forward, her hand stretched out, opening and closing in the way babies reach for things they want to touch. Kale went very still. Nobody breathed. Slowly, so slowly, Kale moved his head forward until Ren's small fingers touched the side of his snout. Ren patted him. Soft, clumsy baby pats, the way she patted everything she was interested in. She looked at her own hand on his scales with a focused, serious expression, then looked up at his face, then patted him again with great satisfaction. Kale did not move. He let her. His eyes had changed. That constant coiled watchfulness had loosened into something quieter, something that Nora thought looked almost like wonder. Dora had been watching from the side with her weight still forward and her head tilted. She was the most cautious of the four in a different way than Kale. Where Kale was watchful, Dora was calculating. She liked to understand things before she engaged with them. She had been studying Ren since the moment the laugh happened, and she had been studying Nora too, watching the way the human woman sat on the floor without tension, the way she moved around the baby with ease, the way she had not flinched or run. Dora made a decision. She moved to the toy bag and pushed her nose into it. Nora looked over. "Go ahead," she said quietly, as though it was completely natural for a scaled hatchling to go through a baby's toy bag. She reached in and pulled out a soft ball, orange and slightly squashed from being in the bag, and held it out. Dora sniffed it. She looked at it. She looked at Nora. Then she took it very carefully in her teeth, gently, nothing like the snap she had aimed at Nora earlier, and moved back to her space with it, where she began turning it over with her claws and examining it from every angle. Sciv had not come forward yet. He was still in his shadowed corner, watching everything. But his posture had changed. The smoke-breathing stillness had relaxed. He was lying down now, his chin resting on his folded front legs, his eyes moving between Ren and Rux and Dora with an expression that was hard to read but was no longer cold. The afternoon moved slowly and warmly. Rux discovered that if he made his tail glow, just a faint pulse of heat that made the bronze scales light up at the tip, Ren would absolutely lose her mind with happiness. He did this approximately 40 times. He did not get tired of it once. He sat in front of her and pulsed his tail and watched her laugh and felt something in his chest that was completely new to him and that he already knew he wanted to keep. Kale allowed Ren to pat his face for a long time. Then he lay down near her, and she immediately used his leg to pull herself up to standing, which she could not quite do on her own yet, and stood there holding his scales with her small hands, looking very proud of herself. Kale looked down at her with an expression that Nora could only describe as deeply careful. Like he understood suddenly that small things needed to be treated differently, not because they were weak, but because they trusted completely and that trust was not nothing. Dora figured out the soft blocks. She stacked them up with surprising delicacy, considering the size of her claws, and then knocked them over and then stacked them again. Nora helped. They did this together for a while in silence, and it was one of the stranger and more comfortable silences Nora had ever sat in. Even SIV came forward eventually. He did not do anything dramatic. He simply moved out of his corner, crossed the room and lay down near the others. Close enough to be part of it. He watched Ren with quiet eyes, and when she looked at him and smiled, he blinked slowly, the long, deliberate blink that in many species means something close to "I see you and I am not afraid of you either." Nora noticed. She said nothing. She just kept her place on the floor, steady and calm, the same way she had been since she first sat down. The light in the nursery changed as the hours passed, going from the pale bright light of midday to the soft amber of late afternoon. Nora fed Ren and the hatchlings watched with interest. She sang a quiet, simple song while she did it, nothing elaborate, just something soft, and the room stayed quiet around her while she sang. By evening, Ren was fighting sleep the way she always did, eyes drooping, then snapping open, then drooping again, her head nodding forward and then pulling back up with great effort, her small body leaning heavier and heavier against whatever was closest. What was closest was Kale. He had not moved from his spot near her in a long time. He was warm the way all scaled creatures are warm, deep and steady like a stone that has sat in the sun all day. Ren leaned into his side and her eyes closed, and this time they did not open again. Her breathing went slow and deep. One small hand rested on his scales and stayed there. Kale looked down at her. He did not move. He stayed exactly where he was, and his breathing slowed to match hers without him seeming to decide to do it, and the room was very quiet and very warm, and Rux curled nearby with his tail still, and Dora and SIV settled close, and the nursery that had broken 11 caregivers held, for one soft evening, nothing but the sound of small things sleeping. Nora sat with her back against the wall, watching all of it, and allowed herself very quietly to smile. The summit ended a day early. This was not something that happened often. Gatherings of 9 system leaders with centuries of politics between them did not usually finish ahead of schedule. They ran long. They ran difficult. They ran into arguments that took hours to untangle and silences that took longer. But this one had moved faster than expected, and by the second evening the final agreements had been signed and the formal closing had been completed and the leaders had begun making their way back to their respective transports. Empress Sorva was the first to leave. She did not tell anyone why. She did not need to. She was the Empress and she did not explain her movements to people at summits. But the truth, the real truth that she kept quietly inside herself as her transport lifted from the summit platform and turned toward home, was simple. She had not stopped thinking about her hatchlings. This was not unusual. She thought about them always, in the way that parents carry their children with them everywhere they go, present in a back corner of the mind no matter what the front of the mind is doing. She had sat through 9 hours of negotiations and trade discussions and border agreements, and the whole time, underneath all of it, she had been aware of them. Kale, Dora, Sci-Fi, Rux. But this time there was something extra. Something she could not quite name. A low, quiet pull that had been getting stronger since the second morning of the summit, a feeling in her chest that was not quite worry and not quite fear but was related to both of them. She had checked the palace communication system twice and found no messages from Nora, which was either very good or very bad, and she could not decide which. She had left before the closing meal. She had apologized to no one. The transport moved fast through the dark between systems, and Empress Sorva sat very straight in her seat the way she always sat, composed and still on the outside, while inside she counted the minutes. The palace came into view through the transport window as they entered the atmosphere, dark and vast and lit softly along its edges by the planet's own light, exactly as it always looked from above. Nothing appeared wrong. No smoke. No unusual activity on the landing platforms. The palace staff who met her transport were calm and unhurried, which meant whatever had happened over the past 2 days had not been bad enough to reach them out here. She walked through the palace corridors faster than she usually did. The staff who saw her coming stepped aside. They knew that walk. They knew the particular way the Empress moved when she was not walking towards something ceremonial but towards something personal, and they had the good sense to stay out of the way. She reached the nursery doors. She stopped. She stood outside them for a moment, one hand raised toward the door. She was preparing herself. She had prepared herself outside these doors before, in the weeks since the babysitter situation had begun, and it had never fully worked. There was always something on the other side that she had not quite expected. Broken things, or a staff member looking shaken, or the hatchlings themselves in some state of upset that took her an hour to calm. She pushed the door open. The first thing she noticed was the quiet. Not the tight-held quiet of a room where something bad had just happened and everything was still in shock. Not the empty quiet of a room with nothing in it. This was a different kind of quiet entirely. It was the quiet of a room where everything had settled. Where things had found their place and stayed there. The second thing she noticed was the light. The nursery lamps had been turned low, giving the room a soft warm glow that she had never seen in this room before because the lamps were usually either blazing at full power or had been knocked over. In this light, the scorch marks on the walls looked less like damage and more like pattern. Even the repaired corner looked softer. The third thing she noticed was her children. They were asleep. All four of them, together, in the center of the nursery floor on the thick nesting material, curled around each other in the particular way that hatchlings sleep when they feel completely safe, bodies overlapping, tails loose, scales not raised but flat and relaxed, breathing slow and even and deep. Kale was on the outside, his large body curved like a wall around the others. Dora was tucked against his side. Siv was behind her, his chin resting on his folded legs. And Rux, small bronze Rux, was pressed into the warmest center of all of them with his tail loosely curled and his golden eyes completely shut. And in the middle of all of them, nestled into the space they had made between their bodies like it had been made specifically for her, was Ren. The Empress stood very still in the doorway. Ren was on her back, both small arms stretched out to either side in the total abandonment of a baby in deep sleep. Her round cheeks were relaxed, her mouth slightly open, her chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of someone completely at rest. One small hand was resting on Rux's scales. Her sock, one of them, had come off again and was somewhere in the nesting material nearby. She looked completely at home. The Empress did not move for a long time. She stood in the doorway with one hand still on the door and looked at her children sleeping around this tiny human infant, this creature so small she could fit in Kale's paw, and she felt something happen in her chest that she did not have immediate words for. She had ruled an empire for a long time. She had held herself with dignity through wars and negotiations and losses that would have broken other rulers. She was not a person who was easily moved in visible ways. But standing in the doorway of her children's nursery, looking at this particular sight, she felt the back of her throat tighten in a way that took her by surprise. A quiet sound from the side of the room made her turn. Nora was there. She was sitting against the wall with her knees drawn up, a small cup of something warm in her hands, looking at the Empress with a calm expression that did not carry any particular triumph in it, which the Empress appreciated more than she could say. The human woman stood up slowly, careful not to make noise, and crossed the room to the doorway. They stepped out into the corridor together. Nora pulled the door almost closed behind them, leaving it open just a crack so the light from the corridor reached the room without disturbing it. The Empress looked at her. She had questions, many of them practical ones about what had happened and how and in what order. But the one that came out first was not practical at all. It came from the part of her that had been sitting in a summit room for 2 days with a quiet pull in her chest, and it came out simply, without ceremony. She asked how. Nora held her cup in both hands and thought for a moment, not because she did not know the answer but because she was finding the right words for it. Then she said it quietly. Ren was not afraid of them. So they did not need to be scary. The Empress was still. She looked at the human woman standing in the corridor outside the nursery, this young calm person who had walked into a room that had defeated 11 others and had simply sat on the floor, and she thought about those words. She turned them over the way she turned difficult things over, carefully, looking at them from different sides. She had spent months trying to find caregivers who were capable enough, experienced enough, strong enough. She had sent warriors and professionals and machines. She had looked for people who could handle the hatchlings. And this human had walked in with a baby on her hip and had not handled them at all. She had simply not been afraid of them, and she had brought with her a creature so young and so open that fear was not yet something it carried. And the hatchlings, who had never in their lives met anything that looked at them without fear, had not known what to do with that except to be curious. And from curiosity had come everything else. The Empress turned and looked back through the crack in the door at her sleeping children. At Kale, who frightened trained soldiers with a look, lying with his body curved protectively around a 10-month-old human infant. At Rux, who had flooded the nursery twice, sleeping with his tail loose and still for the first time she could remember. She had not seen them like this in a very long time. She felt it again, that thing in her chest. It was clearer now. It was not complicated. It was the feeling of a mother who had been worried about her children for a long time, seeing them finally, genuinely at peace. She stood in the corridor with her hand on the door frame and breathed slowly and let herself feel it without trying to be the Empress for a moment. Then she looked at Nora. She did not have the words yet for everything she wanted to say, but she found a few that were enough for now. She said thank you. Not in the formal way of empresses thanking diplomats. In the simple, direct way of one person thanking another for something that had mattered. Nora nodded once without making a fuss of it. And for a while they stood together in the corridor outside the almost closed door, the Empress of 7-star systems and a young human diplomat with a cup of something warm, listening to the sound of small things sleeping on the other side. Nobody meant to take the picture. That was the part that made it travel so far and so fast across so many systems. The fact that it was not staged, not planned, not arranged by any palace communications team or diplomatic image department. It was taken by a junior palace staff member named Will, who was 17 years old and had only been working at the palace for 3 weeks and who had walked past the nursery doorway during the second afternoon to check if the caretaker needed anything. He had looked through the gap in the door. He had stood there for a moment, completely still, not quite believing what he was seeing. Then, because he was 17 and had grown up in a generation that documented everything, he had taken out his personal comm device and taken a single picture before he fully thought about whether he should. In the picture, all 4 hatchlings were lying in a loose, sleepy pile in the afternoon light. They were not fully asleep, their eyes were half open in the heavy, slow way of creatures drifting in and out, but they were completely relaxed, flat scales, loose tails, the particular softness that only came with real comfort. And on each of their heads, slightly crooked, made from small pale flowers that grew in the palace garden and had clearly been picked by a hand too small to reach them without help, was a tiny flower crown. Wren was sitting in the middle of them, very pleased with herself. She had one more flower in her hand and was considering where to put it. Her expression was the focused, serious expression of someone doing important work. Will stood in the doorway for another few seconds. Then he closed the door quietly and went back to his duties and tried to think about something else. He managed this for approximately 4 hours before he sent the picture to his older sister on another station with a short message that said only, "You will not believe where I work." His sister sent it to 3 people. Those 3 people sent it to others. By the following morning it had reached 12 stations across 2 systems. By the afternoon it was in 30. By the time the Empress's formal summit had officially concluded and the news channels were looking for something light to run alongside the trade agreement coverage, the picture had already been shared so many times across so many networks that stopping it would have been like trying to stop water moving downhill. The headline that most outlets used first was simple and accurate: Imperial hatchlings tamed by human infant. The responses came fast and from every direction. Military analysts across the outer systems issued statements that were carefully worded but could not quite hide the fact that they found the whole thing deeply unsettling in a way they could not explain. The Vethrai hatchlings had been considered a useful symbol of imperial power for generations. The idea that they had spent an afternoon having flower crowns placed on their heads by a 10-month-old was not something that fit easily into any existing strategic document. Several analysts used the word unprecedented. One used the word concerning, then apparently thought better of it and changed it to remarkable. Scientists from 4 different institutions published quick response pieces about human infant behavior and the neurological basis of fearlessness in very young creatures. One paper, written overnight and released the morning after the picture spread, argued that human babies occupied a unique position in the known galaxy, too young to have learned which things were dangerous, too socially oriented to respond to threat displays with anything other than interest, and neurologically wired to find novelty delightful rather than alarming. The paper concluded that Wren had not been brave. She had simply not yet been taught what to be afraid of. The piece was widely shared. Many people found it fascinating. Several found it quietly moving. Other species responded in their own ways. The Krellian Cultural Network ran a long discussion about what it meant that their most experienced elder had lasted 22 minutes while a human infant had lasted 3 days and asked to stay longer. The Luvani Caretaking Authority released a short statement saying they were reviewing their training protocols in light of recent events, which was widely understood to mean that they were embarrassed and were hoping everyone would eventually forget about the 2 workers, one of whom had been found behind a decorative vase. They would not forget. Nobody was going to forget that. Messages arrived at the human outpost in numbers that overwhelmed the normal system. Felix, who managed communications, spent 3 full days doing nothing but sorting them. Requests for interviews. Academic inquiries. Invitations. Several species who had complicated and long-standing relationships with the Vethrai Empire sent careful, diplomatic messages asking whether humans might be available to assist with other sensitive situations. 2 of these messages were clearly fishing for something much larger than they said directly, and George flagged them immediately for the senior diplomatic office back on Earth. Nora knew none of this for the first day. She was still at the palace. She found out the way she found out most things. Someone told her. In this case it was Will, who appeared at the nursery door on the morning after the Empress returned, looking simultaneously proud and terrified, to explain what he had done. He held his comm device out to Nora with the picture on the screen and the sharing count visible beneath it, which at that point was already in the hundreds of thousands. Nora looked at the picture for a long moment. She looked at Wren in the center of the hatchlings with her flower and her expression of deep satisfaction. She looked at Rux's crown, which was slightly sideways, and Kale's, which Wren had apparently placed very carefully and which was nearly straight. She handed the device back to Will. She told him to go get some breakfast. He left, still looking terrified, and Nora went back to the nursery where the hatchlings were awake and Wren was attempting to convince Rux to let her sit on his back, which Rux was considering more seriously than he should have been. The Empress called for Nora 2 days later, in the formal reception room this time rather than the corridor outside the nursery. She was sitting in the full arrangement of her position. The chair, the formal clothes, the particular stillness that meant this was official. But her eyes when Nora entered were the same eyes that had stood in the corridor and said thank you in the simple way of one person to another. There were 2 palace officials present to record the conversation formally. The Empress spoke clearly and without preamble. She was creating a new position. It had not existed before in the history of the Vethrai Empire. The position was diplomatic liaison between the human outpost and the Imperial Palace, with direct access to the Empress's office and a seat at any table where human and Vethrai interests overlapped. The position was being offered to Nora. The official reason, recorded in the Imperial document and later published to the Galactic Diplomatic Register, was listed as demonstrated ability to communicate across the boundary of fear. Nora accepted. She asked one question before they moved to the formal parts. She asked whether she could bring Wren sometimes. The Empress said that Wren had a standing invitation to the palace for as long as she wanted to come. One of the palace officials wrote this down with a completely straight face, which was professionally impressive. Back at the human outpost, the reaction to Nora's appointment was complicated in the warm way that good news among people who care about each other is always a little complicated. George shook her hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake needed. Ada made a sound that she later described as not crying. Felix said he had always known she was the right person for the job, which was not what he had said at the time but which nobody corrected because it was a kind thing to say. Callum brought bread. The picture kept moving. It crossed into systems that had not been in contact with the Vethrai Empire in decades. It reached species who had no diplomatic relationship with humans at all and who learned, through a single image of a baby and 4 sleeping hatchlings and 5 slightly crooked flower crowns, that humans existed and that they were apparently like this. Several species filed formal requests through the Galactic Contact Registry to open communications with the Human Diplomatic Service, citing the image as their reason. One request, from a small and very old civilization in the far outer systems, said simply, "We would like to know more about your people." They seem unafraid. Wren herself was unaware of all of it. On the day the appointment was made official, she was at the palace garden with Rux, who had discovered that if he glowed his tail in the sunlight it made different colors in the grass, and who had been doing this for Wren for the better part of an hour. She laughed every single time. He showed no signs of stopping. Kale watched from nearby with the careful attention he had given her since the first afternoon, still and settled, his large body between her and the rest of the garden in a way that was not taught or asked but simply done. Somewhere across 100 star systems the picture traveled on. In it, 4 of the most feared young creatures in the known galaxy slept in a pile of warmth and flower crowns, and a 10-month-old sat in the middle of them looking like she had always belonged there. Because in the way that mattered she had. Humanity had sent its best minds into the stars, its most prepared diplomats, its most capable machines. It had worked hard to be taken seriously by civilizations that had existed for thousands of years before the first human ever looked up and wondered what was out there. But it was Wren, with no fear and no plan and one sock, who had walked into the hardest room in the Empire and made it soft. And the galaxy, slowly, across 100 systems and 1,000 shared screens, looked at that picture and felt something it had not expected to feel. It smiled.